novel's told from the perspective of a young boy called Sean Bull. We also get his voice when he's older, sort of now, as a 40-year-old, looking back to the early 80s and to the first years of the Thatcher government. It's set in the Black Country where I'm from. It's set in Dudley, you know, where I grew up, and it's really, like I've written 2 previous novels also set in the Black Country, and it's an attempt partly to sort of capture that world and that area and that identity, I suppose. And the book tells the story of Sean as a young boy, sort of looking around him, seeing loads of changes happening in the area that he's in with his family and in the wider area, with job losses, factory closures, real sort of tension and difficulty, again within his own family and the outside world, and him sort of coming to a series of conclusions about what's happening, and really deciding that all this trouble, you know, he kind of projects it completely onto Margaret Thatcher, and it's the story of how he sets out to one day try and kill her. Yeah. Obviously, with Thatcher's death and the coverage around it, it kind of brought that time back into like, the public arena. I'm not sure the perception's changed, apart from the fact that the issues that are in the book have probably come more to the fore in being discussed more widely.
What was it that made you decide to tell Sean's story? What was it? What was the impetus that made you think, okay, now's the time is right to talk about the 80s?
You know, talking specifically, Dudley went through like a real terrible time during that period, like loads of other towns up and down the country, you know, with industries sort of being killed, you know, like being right, this is not, this way of life isn't going to happen anymore. And you see that like across the country. It's interesting that since I've left there, you know, I've worked for a long time in East London. The school was right next to the docks, and that went through a similar. You know, it's not a north-south. Sometimes people write about this, it's a north-south. I mean, I'm writing about the Midlands anyway, but you know, it's that interesting sort of thing where you know, go to East London. You had the same experiences. I lived in Nottingham for a while and taught in a town just north of Nottingham, Sutton in Ashfield, which is an old mining town. Exactly the same thing. You know, you've got this early 80s absolute transformation, and yeah, from that political angle, I think it's really important. I felt I wanted to write something that was very personal and a kind of record of like of what it was like at that time.
You say it's very personal, and I was just wondering how close it was actually to your story.
It is personal. I mean, it's not an autobiographical novel. Partly because the book starts with a division within the family, in that some members of the family have voted Tory, and I thought that was really important as well, because it's also, you often get this picture painted that of this sort of you know, class war, but I think Thatcherism was different in that there was, you know, the experience of plenty of working class people wanting to, and again, this is maybe why it's different. It's very specific in that it's like the Midlands setting, and there was, you know, there's plenty of people obviously voting for her, wanting to, you know, the whole thing like of like buying your council house and thinking that this was the way forward, and seeing it as wanting to see it as this kind of liberating thing. I wanted to get across that there was like this real division. The grandad character in the book, I was really I was pleased with writing, and although he's not based on anybody in particular, it's certainly, you know, men of that generation that I know, and some of the things he says are exactly like stuff I'd heard growing up or even here now. And he's a bit bemused at the time. He's like, his own brother's voted Tory, and he keeps looking around. He's going, well, some people have voted for him, because there's also this sense of like, just this sense of division, really, and a real sense of bitterness, like a real feeling of like betrayal, I guess. That it's like, it's a novel, so I don't make it sound like a political essay, and it's really important it's a novel. It's like people's story, so it's very subjective, and it's all from Sean's perspective in the book. But But I'm really interested in that relationship between, you know, personal experience and then this wider political landscape. So the stuff going on within their own family, like, you know, as with all families, like family tension and just different relationships that is somehow then kind of magnified in this bigger backdrop. Because they're really, I think what Sean's granddad realises, I think, and I'm trying to get that across early in the book, is that they are very vulnerable. And actually, I don't think the other characters particularly feel that, because they live in an established community and people go out to work and it's kind of, this is the way we live and this is the way it's happened for a long time. And then I think what a lot of the effects of Thatcherism were to sort of break a lot of those kind of bonds. It's that sort of divide and rule type attitude, definitely. And there's, like, you know, loads of ramifications to that.
What's been the response from people living in the location where the book is set? I mean, I know it's a fictional location, but it is based on a real place, right?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, and there are quite a few real places mentioned within the book. It's like the kind of fictional area sort of fits in between places that people would know. So if you're from there, you can kind of work out where it is on a map pretty easily.
There's a valley or something where the mines used to be.
It's the whole still. The idea in the book is, and that's kind of a bit of an amalgamation. Yeah. There's I've written in a previous book. I've kind of made this area called Cindy Heath, which doesn't exist. That's not a real place. But it's based on the kind of the idea of, like, the big steelworks that existed around there. Like there was a works called Round Oak, another one called Peyton Shaft. But they're in different places. I've sort of moved it to Dudley, really, and Cinder Heath being between Dudley and Tipton, so very specific locations. It's kind of taken a bit of it's what writers do, I suppose. I've moved things around, I mean, I think the very specific kind of local reaction, I think, has been pretty good. I mean, with some people more widely, I mean, I think particularly with this book, because there's a political angle to it, I think it chimes a lot with people's experiences at that time. I've had, like, lots of, like, kind of warm sort of personal reaction to it.
Do you think that those people who are living in those communities would categorise the work as working class fiction? Would you categorise it as that?
I think it's difficult to be anything other than specific, in that I wouldn't want to be saying, or people. I think it's a real risk with writing a book set in, like, a working class area or with working class characters. It suddenly becomes, this represents, like, the whole of, like, working class Britain, and
it's just your take, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it is very, very specific, because I think those experiences of those Thatcher years, it's very early in that government as well, which was a particular feature, I think, of like of being in the West Midlands. And also it's really specifically about, like, local culture. So it is a book about Dudley and a book about a character in Dudley. So I don't know, it's representative of him and that family, and then to a lesser extent, it's like one experience of that area. I reckon there are, I mean, obviously you end up hearing, certainly on a personal level, you end up hearing, like, the nice comments, particularly from Dudley. I'm sure there's loads of people who would have lived there who go, this is not what I remember, and this is not what I think, and that's fine. You know, that's the job. That's what's interesting about being a novelist, I think, as well, and about writing. It is subjective, and it is about that personal story, and that's what I really want to tell. That's why I want to write novels and not anything else. But I think it is a risk facing anyone writing, where you suddenly get labelled as representative of this element of community, you know.
So I wanted to move on to talk about craft and technique of writing novels. I wanted to talk a little bit about your process for writing this particular book. Was it different to your previous novels, and could you tell me a little bit about the structure and character development that you used in those novels, and what did you do differently this time? What changed, if anything?
The three novels that I've written are quite closely related in terms of their setting, They're, you know, really specifically set in Dudley in the Black Country, but in terms of the way I wrote them, in terms of structure, I think they've become quite different. Particularly the relationship between this book and my previous book, Heartland, which was much more of a collective piece. How I Killed Margaret Thatcher is written in the first person to start with. It's the first time I've used that, so it's very much from Sean's point of view, and it's his voice. Then, you know, developing that from that kind of limited perspective, I found quite a challenge technically, which is interesting because the previous novel, Heartland, in terms of structure, was quite complicated in that it uses the structure of a football match to tell a much wider story. So in some ways the book's set within a kind of 90-minute frame, and in other ways it kind of moves back and forth through time, telling the stories of different characters, which in piecing together was technically quite technically quite difficult. Whereas this, you'd think, well, it's one voice, it's a straight story, it's told kind of pretty much chronologically, should be easier. But I think there are real challenges with first person. This thing of like assuming a character, and you've got to really like inhabit that character. Whereas, although that's true of writing novels anyway, I think there is something about this kind of first person, and the fact that a lot of the way I found almost like technically around that with this wider political stuff is then having the two voices. So that came much later in the process of writing the novel. Originally when I started writing, it was a straight sort of child's voice telling a story from 1979 through to, you know, 84.
Sean seems like the novel's moral centre, and young as he is, the rest of the family seem to orbit around him in a sense. Was it difficult to maintain such a strong voice in such a young child, and did it change your perception of children somewhat?
I don't think it's changed my perception of children, and I think what coloured some of the writing is I've worked as a teacher for a long time, and I'm really aware the fact that you can be very young and have a lot of experiences, and I think that maybe is what sort of channeled into Sean. So in that respect, I wasn't worried about that. I wasn't worried about his perception of the world around him in that sense. And I think technically what a solution I found to that kind of wider political backdrop was putting in his voice as an older person, you know. So his voice as an adult frames what's going on as a child, and they do sort of bleed into one another really. But that's the idea, because that's the thing about we change as we get older, and part of us remains the same and part of us changes. So I was pleased to be able to do that and to have found that kind of almost a solution to a challenge by having the two voices in.